to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. One thing that's fun about being older, there are some fun things, is you get to see things develop over time. And being someone who's been interested in psychedelics and part of the psychedelic intelligentsia for many decades now, it's been really wonderful to kind of get a sense of how the generations have evolved, certainly since the counterculture, when really this stuff broke out of very small worlds of researchers and doctors in the 50s and 60s and opened up into this enormous world of countercultural spirituality and renegade science that has been continuing since that point. And of course, nowadays things are changing drastically in the world of psychedelics. It's, every week there's some article in a newspaper about how ketamine can help people suffering massive depression, the rise of ayahuasca tourism, the studies across the country and indeed across the globe looking at psychedelics for everything from treating end-of-life anxiety to PTSD, and the list goes on and on. And it's kind of interesting because my generation, I'm turning 50 next year. I was born in June of the Summer of Love. Is sort of in between these worlds. In a way, we grew up in the shadow of the hippie scene, much more kind of as much punk rock influence as well as 80s video game influence as 60s psychedelia. And we were kind of party to a number of these transitions as they started to begin, the rise of Burning Man, the emergence of research chemical market, ultimately facilitated by the internet. But things are changing even more now. And one of my big questions, and indeed sometimes one of the frustrations about being a bit older, is it's sometimes hard to meet younger folks who are doing things that are really, really inspiring, because they often have their own, social networks and own groups, and that's sort of what happens to people. So one of the things I've really enjoyed about the psychedelic scene as a space, as a place of conferences, of conversations, of personal relationships, of texts, is that in comparison with most parts of our society, it's very intergenerational. I remember when I started to go to my first gatherings, and you'd have these enthusiastic young folks talking to, wizened elders of both genders, which has always been an important part of the scene. And so there's a space for kind of people talking through and across different spaces in space and time. And so I was very happy to make the acquaintance of our guest today, Katie Tomlinson. Not too terribly long ago, we camped next to each other at a small festival and had a wonderful time with long conversations. And it was one of the high points of the festival, actually, was talking to her and her friends and getting to know them and getting to sense a kind of different perspective, like what's actually coming up when people who, let's say, are young people in college, and it's already a world where MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, is already doing its thing, revolutionizing the discourse and the practice of psychedelic therapy and science. So I just invited Katie onto the show so we can talk about her work as a psychedelic activist and how she thinks about these things and what the future holds. So Katie, thanks for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, great. I thought it probably makes sense to start out just talking a little bit about your own history with this stuff, and you show up in college. I know you went to Evergreen, which is already a kind of interesting place. Might be nice touching on, and just sort of how you found your way towards an interest in psychedelics, and then from that an interest in really using it as a way to do and think politics.
Yeah. So I guess I first got interested in psychedelics when I was 17, and I had a friend who was interested in them. And at that point, I was still in high school, and I was very confused by my friends' interest in them because I had, because of prohibition and propaganda, I had believed that all drugs were addictive, all drugs were bad. But then there was this person that I really respected who was speaking very highly of them, which from that point kind of led to what has been an ongoing love affair with psychedelics. I studied them for about 6 months before ever taking them. And then when the first time I took them, I felt like I had stumbled upon something really special and life-changing. I went to the first MAPS conference. Excuse me, I went to Psychedelic Science, not the MAPS conference. I should stop. It's a conference thrown by multiple psychedelic organizations. And at that point, got more keyed into the psychedelic community, made some connections that are still ongoing today. And then a little bit after that, I had my first, what I describe as my first major religious experience with psychedelics, which is always funny looking back on it and seeing that I still had such a strong interest even without that component. And then from that point, I went to Evergreen, and I started the Greeners Association for Psychedelic Studies. And that was really pivotal. It has been really pivotal in my development as a person and just the things that we were able to do as a group. The organization, we did things like we went to Psychedelic Science with 10 students. We went to the Women's Visionary Congress and we spoke at the Women's Visionary Congress. Our last year there, we threw a psychedelic conference called Generation Psychedelic, and we brought many of what we saw. We were trying to create a platform for the younger voices in the psychedelic movement. So we brought people like Terry Gotham, Brad Burge, so on and so forth. And and then just along with that too, we had weekly meetings. We had integration circles with an elder from the psychedelic community. Her name is Law. And then we also had harm reduction workshops. And I felt like we got to do a lot of really good things on campus, and the group is still in existence right now. I just talked to the new coordinator the other day. It's in its 5th year now, which is pretty rare for student groups at Evergreen to continue on that long. So yeah, I'm excited, and I feel like we left a really good footprint on the campus.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we covered a lot of stuff there. I'd love to go back and
Go ahead.
unpack some of it. I mean, I first off, I really admire the impulse to study these things before deciding to jump on in. I mean, I think that's one of the things that I find reflected through your experience and many of the younger people that I encounter. That was less true in my era, and I think even less true in the one before, where there was a sort of sense that there was a value in studying and thinking and learning about the space that one was going to go into before just plunging in. And and indeed, there's so many different angles to the thing as well that's already sort of a wide open situation. What does it mean to study? What does it mean to kind of prepare for it? And so I was curious, like since it was really later that you began to see the full spiritual potential and to the point of thinking about these things as possible facilitators, sometimes as facilitators of religious experience. When you were younger and you were first kind of getting interested in you're talking with your friends, what was it that intrigued you? What was it that made this seem worthwhile to study and then worthwhile to take a risk on at your relatively young age?
Yeah. I think a lot of it was just trying to understand, like, if these substances weren't as bad as people had told me they were, like, why were they being hidden? So there might have been a little bit of the sense of the taboo there. It might have also just been from, looking at my older sister and seeing her experiment with psychedelics and being fine. And I feel like that it's hard thinking back on it too, because it was so long ago. I feel like it was just, at first it was kind of like a passing curiosity, and then Yeah, you were saying that the older generations, you guys didn't really have the chance for research, but this generation is really lucky because we have things like Arrowwood. So it might have honestly just been at first been a passing interest, but then going on to Arrowwood and seeing all of that information and learning about all those different experiences, I feel like my interest got more and more piqued. Looking back on it now, it's kind of like seeing that there's a whole another dimension to reality and the life experiences that we can have that I've been told my whole life that was not something that was accessible.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's now that you say that, it just reminds me how if one part of these experiences and these substances is something kind of I don't maybe esoteric is a word where it's it's sort of a secret. People maybe you got to figure out how to do it. It's not legal. It's something that happens within a small kind of community. But by the time once you have the internet, once you have sites like the Arrowwood and the Lyceum and the other ones, that there's a sort of just a kind of in a world of objective or reasonably objective information, of group lore, of note taking, of this whole kind of zone that balances out in a way the sort of countercultural esotericism of the things, and makes it really does make for a much more balanced thing. And I remember when I was in high school, we were nerds, so we were reading things. We read all, there were a lot of hippie books around, but it was a very different thing. It was much more like an introduction into into like a hidden world or a sort of other sort of society. It wasn't like as data driven. And I think that even just the fact that the environment itself is more full of data and more full of kind of rational approaches to these, in many ways, post-rational or non-rational experiences, that alone, I would like to think just creates a healthier set of expectations and certainly a healthier set of habits that is appropriate to the sometimes difficulty of these things. But did you think about them initially in terms of religion and spirituality? Were you interested in religion and spirituality when you were younger, or was that actually almost something that you kind of came to through your apprenticeship with these experiences?
It was something more that I came to. I don't know, it's kind of hard to describe. Like, I think my first real spiritual awakening I had, and the spiritual awakenings I've had subsequently from this point have got deeper and deeper and continue to get deeper, was actually reading Life of Pi. I don't know if you're familiar with that book or the movie.
I know it a bit, but why don't you sum it up?
So in Life of Pi, there is a character who initially is raised to be Hindu. His father is an atheist, though, but he has a strong attachment to his Hindu beliefs, and then afterwards he also discovers Christianity, and then he discovers Islam, and he ends up following all three of these religions at once, which, his mother is supportive, but his dad, being an atheist, is like incredibly confused. But the initial part of these books is just an exploration of this character's way of finding and connecting to God through all of these different means. And I think that was the book that kind of turned me into a perennialist, and seeing that, oh, okay, there are all of these different religions in the world. These religions have all come to be at certain points without influence of the other. Obviously now they're influencing, but in different points of history. So that means that there must be this core place that religion is coming to. And I felt really awesome when I discovered that. I don't think it wasn't necessarily like a personal experience of the divinity, but it was just kind of a knowledge that it was there. But kind of after that realization, it definitely went more into the background, and it was not something that I was focused on, which, thinking about what I know about spirituality now, that kind of makes sense. I didn't really have any sort of practice or any way to reconnect back to that feeling. And I remember even saying when I was younger too, that like I didn't want to rely on substances to give me a connection to spirituality. So I definitely feel like I had a more, I guess, hedonistic period with psychedelics where I wasn't as connected or thinking about that. But then I went to a psy-trance event called Go Agil, and I kind of got opened up and realized what the actual potential of psychedelics were. And I left kind of with this sense of feeling like, oh, even though I said I didn't want to find my spirituality through psychedelics, I realized that this was kind of the thing that I was really looking for this whole time. And that was kind of like, I don't know. I think there is potential for abuse of psychedelics. And I think I kind of fell more into that a little bit when I was younger. And I feel like when I had that religious experience, it was like, oh, this is the hole that I was trying to fill.
Well, that's very interesting. It's like you almost kind of like you weren't being motivated as a seeker. I think that's true often in people's experiences where they're interesting, they're fun, they add a lot of wonder and surprise and weirdness to what can be a kind of fairly boring modern life where all the old enchantments have been chased away, and so we kind of get into it on that level, and then sometimes the experiences that happen within that framework are just so powerful, or they're so resonant, or they almost themselves seem to draw together these different threads of our lives and our minds that can bring us into a more religious or spiritual frame of mind. And since some folks aren't going to know about Goa Gill and what his parties are like, or indeed even what's sort of particular about psy-trance as a kind of music, electronic dance music, but one that is specifically kind of that's keyed to both psychedelics and religious experience in a certain way. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that revolutionary festival.
Yeah. So I went to Goa Gill many times before I had this experience, and honestly, at first I was pretty put off by the music. Goa Gill plays psy-trance, but his psy-trance usually ranges between 150 to 180 BPMs. And it's described as being dark psy-trance or dark psy. And it definitely, like, when you first hear it, you're like, this music is really menacing and kind of off-putting, and I don't get it. But I kept going to the events because I was really interested in, when I was younger, I was really involved in the Portland psy-trance community, and I was really liked the community that was around it, and I liked being around these people that were really passionate about their use of psychedelics. So I kind of kept going to the event, that event for the community, but there was also just this sense of like, I don't get this music. This music is awful. Why? But then when I had an ex-partner who kind of made me realize that there was another realm to the psychedelic experience. And at that point I went to the festival with him, and I kind of realized like, okay, like, he's going for a really different experience. So I just kind of put in my head that like, okay, there is this another realm of experience. Like, why not like open myself up to that? And I found that at first I kind of feel like I got like beaten down and pummeled by the music and had a very intense death experience. But then at that point, after the death experience had ended, the way that I describe it is I feel like I died and went to heaven. And at that point, the music that, even though the music that just previously minutes ago had sounded awful and horrible, all of a sudden it sounded like the most angelic music I'd ever heard. And looking at psy-trance now, the way that I kind of interpret it is that in dark psy, there are so many different frequencies present. Like you have the strong driving bass, which has a more kind of that dark, sinister side to it. But then you also have these higher notes that are happening. And when you're in that psychedelic state, I feel like whatever experience you're having, if you're open to it, you'll latch on to whatever notes are happening that relate most to your experience. But it also, I think there's just something really special about it too, because it has all of those frequencies present at the same time. Like it really feels like, I don't know, the way I describe it is like almost like a universal language, or I don't know, it's for me that music is really sacred.
Yeah, and it's interesting just thinking about, Goa Gill, who he was, and the role he played in kind of developing electronic dance music as a vehicle for psychedelic all night mystical and hedonistic celebration. In India, he went over to Goa and in the late 60s, early 70s, like so many people, and had stayed there off and on for through to today. And that was the place where the kind of more spiritual dimension of what would eventually become rave culture was developed in the 80s, as people started using electronic music not just to have fun, but to kind of create a night-long celebratory soundtrack for intense voyaging. And I think and that music then kind of evolves into psy-trance, and now it's all over the world. It's one of the the strongest, I guess one of the more global EDM musics, and it's anywhere you go, it's kind of recognizably associated with these situations of psychedelic transformation. Thinking back on that experience, though, how much do you think it was because you sort of decided to open up to that possibility almost beforehand that allowed that dimension to unveil itself, versus it just sort of happened? And this is something, I mean, it's a real key question with psychedelics. How much of it is our expectation or our willingness to see how this might work if we adopt a different framework that maybe isn't even our natural way of doing it, that really allows something new to happen, versus things just happening that you're not really in control of, and then they force a change.
I mean, I think go ahead.
No. I was just going to ask what you thought.
I feel like, I know with my history of psychedelics, like one of the things that I kind of like picked up that was a negative trait in the psy-trance community was that there were people around me who were doing lots and lots of acid, to the point where they were going about many of their normal routines and were able to keep themselves very controlled while they were under their experience. And that, me being like 18 years old and being around these people that I looked up to and seeing that, I kind of started to adapt that as well. Not like I wasn't going to work or anything like that, but there was definitely this sense of me wanting to control the experience and being able to, I guess, quote unquote, like handle my shit while I was high. Which ended up being really detrimental in the long run. It kind of made me much less sensitive to the substances. It made it much harder for me. I think that's why I went like 3 or 4 years of using psychedelics pretty frequently before I had my religious experience. So I think that is kind of for me like what blocked me and made me realize that trying to control the experience, like you can do that, but it's going to block you from being able to eventually let go. I feel like there's also many people I've met though where they take psychedelics and the first time they have that experience. And what I find with those people is they're very open, they're very receptive already, and they're able to kind of just like letting go and going with the flow is kind of already their natural inclination. But
that's not the way you were.
No, that is not the way I was. I've become more like that. Meditation has helped a lot. I used to do 5 rhythms, which is a form of 5 rhythms and open floor. It was just a form of dancing meditation, and I started doing that much more frequently after my religious experience that I had, and that made it much more easy for me to surrender and let go when I was in the psychedelic state, because I figured out how to do that when I was sober afterwards. And I also take psychedelics far less than I did when I was younger, and that's also like lowered my sensitivity. That's actually probably one of the big things I've gotten from my psychedelic use, is just becoming a more like receptive person who's like willing to kind of surrender in the right moments.
Oh, well, one interesting question for me is why you choose to describe your experience, which while it obviously had spiritual or religious imagery, a sense of heaven, a sense of dark night of the soul, of death, of rebirth, these kind of sort of a topography of experience that we can talk about forever in terms of Jung and religious death and rebirth and all these things. But it's still a very interesting decision, especially if you were coming from a more hedonistic kind of secular perspective, to use the phrase religious experience, to claim religious experience as a legitimate term for what you're talking about, as opposed to, well, I had this really trippy thing happen and this and that, and it made me a little more open or whatever. But there's something that's very significant to my mind about standing for that term and the way and just asserting, confirming that these substances are part of religious experience, or that they're deeply related. Where does that come from for you? How did that work?
Yeah, I think that at first, I definitely didn't realize it as a religious experience at first. I definitely saw it as a spiritual experience. But then I think my education at Evergreen was pretty awesome in that it allowed me to explore things pretty freely and openly. And there was a book, actually I'm holding it right now, called Psychoactive Sacramentals, which is all about going into how psychedelics are for spiritual growth. And one of the things I found in it was, it was, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Pahnke. Pahnke, is that how you?
Pahnke, yeah.
Pahnke, yeah. Pahnke's Good Friday experiment, where he, so Pahnke went around and he talked to mystics and people who had really deep religious experiences, and he was trying to understand like the 9 core, like the core traits of them, and he identified 9 different core traits. And then at that point, he met Timothy Leary, and he was really shocked because it was like, well, why is Timothy Leary talking like the Buddhist mystics I've met? And at that point, too, like they kind of determined through the Good Friday experiment that they could bring about the same experience that the other mystics were having, but they were doing it with psychedelics, which obviously there's good and bad for bringing it about with psychedelics or bringing it about with more traditional means. But yeah, I remember when I just read those 9 core traits, like feeling super shocked, because I was like, oh, this is like what happened to me. Like, this is putting it in terms. And from that point, a big part of my education at Evergreen was studying mystical experiences from that point and trying to understand them. I have a lot of my credits are in consciousness and spirituality, and I feel like that kind of reading that chapter in that book is what motivated that further.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's more, I think, evidence for the way in which, whatever else they are, psychedelics create or open up the possibility for you to build your own relationship with them, so that how you think about them, how you talk about them, how the things you read, the things you research, all these seemingly secondary activities, so different than the experience of actually being in this altered state, actually really, in a way, are integral to making meaning. Not just making meaning of these experiences, but just how we make meaning in general. It's like you get to see the way in which we make meaning out of our experience, and that those meanings then in turn, influence subsequent experiences. And so you get this evolving kind of learning process where you're both learning about something that's non-human, that's out of our control, that has its own sort of weird agenda, depending on how you want to think about it, whether it's just neurological metabolism, or whether there are, agents and agencies in other realms, to take a much farther out example. But regardless of that, there's still this way in which we're kind of co-creating the process, and particularly as modern people who might come across these things as part of just partying or just exploring as a kid or whenever, and then really going, hey, we can actually kind of build these things in different ways. And that's a lot of what we see there. That's why there's such a wide range of people's reactions to them. Some people still take them very much in a kind of secular frame of enjoyment and exploration, and other people take them, in a profoundly religious framework where the medicine is holy. It brings them into a sacred environment. They can map the worlds they encounter according to some kind of cosmology. And then a lot of us, I think probably both you and I, are somewhere in between these these kind of modes, and being able to study the kind of stuff you did in schools, of course, makes a huge difference on how you're able to talk about these things, but also how they actually, appear to you as well.
Mm-hmm. I think a big reason too why I speak the way I do is also just that it comes from having run the student group, and also just from my own experience of I've been studying psychedelics for a really long time, and no one had ever kind of directly said to me hey, psychedelics can lead to mystical experience. And I feel like it's one of those things that people are kind of shy to talk about, or their humbleness kind of stops them from talking about it, because no one wants to come out and say oh, well, I've had this great, amazing, life-changing mystical experience. Because then at that point, there's that fear of your sanity coming into question, or just do you have delusions of grandeur? But I feel like it is important, especially when in the role I was in, I felt like it was important for me to talk about, because I saw students having these experiences, and I wanted them to know what had happened to them, and I wanted them to be able to get the resources. And I also just wanted people to know that hey, this is an option for if you keep using psychedelics, this is something that could happen.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it was partly out of seeing how that possibility, that idea worked as part of the group that you were doing. Maybe talk a little bit more about, how you set that up. I mean, it sounds like one of the things you were doing were these sort of integration circles, which are so important. And it really seems like there's more of that activity now than there was. And I'm just kind of curious how you decided to start holding those circles, or how you even, once you decided, hey, let's have a psychedelic group on campus, how you thought, well, what does that mean? What should we do? I mean, there's a lot of different things we can do. Why did you make the decisions you did in terms of how you decided to work with that format?
It felt like the right thing to do. It felt like, I saw all these other student groups on campus, and Evergreen is, for people that don't know Evergreen, it's a very liberal college in Olympia, Washington. There are psychedelic mushrooms growing on campus. It has a very strong psychedelic history. And it was one of those things, I feel like psychedelics were already such a strong undercurrent at Evergreen, but they were kind of in the shadows. So for me, I just kind of felt like we were at a point, with where psychedelics are, that we could start talking about them more openly. And mostly I just wanted to. I thought it would be fun.
And then, how did you structure the circles? Did you have sort of an invitation, here we're going to have a night where everybody can talk about their experiences, and would you invite feedback? Would you just sort of let people describe their own? How did everybody's individual experience feed into the process that the group was going through in terms of coming up with new ways to think about and to discuss these matters?
I mostly let so in the situations of the integration circles, I kind of played a more passive role aside from setting them up. As I mentioned before, La Lorian, she was the woman who we brought in to hold the integration circles and to hold space for that. And La is an elder within the psychedelic community and someone I have a lot of respect for. And I met La about a year after starting the student group. So it was in our second year that we started bringing her in and having her facilitate. And for me, it was really important to have La, because La is an elder. And one of the things that I want to see more in the psychedelic community, kind of like what you were talking about, is more relationship between the younger generations and older generations, which even outside of the psychedelic community is something I feel we're lacking on. And La also, at the end of the day, has been in the psychedelic community much longer than me and has much more experience. So I felt like she was much more qualified.
So would she offer feedback for? I mean, and I ask this probably because I've just started to participate in some integration circles in the Bay Area, and it's an interesting world because on some level you're just there to provide space for people to talk through on their own, and you maybe even come up with some if they have a problem or if there's a concern, to maybe even discover it on their own. But then there are other times when you can see people, being someone who's this isn't my first rodeo, going like, oh, that's heading towards delusion, or that's heading towards megalomania, and that's where you see things that are like kind of recognizable dangers, and then you're like, well, what am I doing?
Yeah.
This isn't like, they're not paying me for therapy, and like how you kind of offer gently feedback to try to avoid some of the problems that are there. I mean, some of the real issues that do come up with people that they're not always aware of, and can be damaging. So it's an interesting it's an interesting thing to try to navigate.
We got, in the time that I was at Evergreen, I think we got really lucky. No one really came to the group expressing problems like that. But that was definitely one of the concerns that the faculty had, was that, we're not allowed to offer, at Evergreen, you're not allowed to do like therapy circles through your group. So we kind of had to assure them, like, no, we're not doing therapy. Like, we're giving support and talking, but it's not, we're not doing anything like that. It was more, I feel like it was a space for people to be witnessed. A lot of times, if it was a more sensitive topic, individuals would reach out to Law and ask to talk to her separately. But for the most part, I mean, it was mostly just a space to kind of come together and to talk about our experiences, and to see that, like, we weren't alone in our experiences, and also to see that someone had really been there before.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. That sense of continuity. I mean, that is part of the thing that the community need. That's probably why it's there, and what it needs to keep doing is to, create a place where you get a sense of continuity. Like even just the willingness to use a term like elder to describe, somebody from another generation is already like a kind of gesture towards a possible way of being that is not the natural way we have in the modern world, where we're just like, oh, they're old people, or they're from a different generation. They don't have anything to say to me. Who cares? Especially now, because young people live more and more horizontal social lives, because the robustness of social connections within a generation are so even greater now than it was in the 60s, when there was already this kind of generation gap. And it's been, I think that's actually both one of the sweetest and also in some ways one of the greater failings of the psychedelic movement, is that even though they should have known better, the first generation didn't do a very good job of figuring out organic, supportive ways to hand over information. There are some serious major exceptions, and the whole world of psychedelic conferences in some sense is a way of trying to create a way of offering these conversations between, but the kind of intimacy that you're talking about with an integration circle, but also the recognition that there is someone like an elder. There is a role like an elder. I mean, I remember the first time somebody called me an elder, and I don't even know if I was in my 40s yet. And I kind of gulped, but I was like, well, whatever, man. I mean, I'm playing a role in their world. I'm glad to be here, because they were mostly 15, 20 years younger than me, that I was hanging out with. So I'm like, okay, I'll take it. But it also is a sign of a certain maturity about recognizing the value of that that kind of conversation, and the value in the other way as well, because it's the circumstances that one has, especially when you start exploring these things. That really influences in a way your whole approach to them, and sometimes it's much harder to understand what's happening with younger generations. So for me, like, I can't imagine growing up when Arrowwood's there, or when research chemicals are available online. And I mean, it's just mind blowing. Like, I don't even know how to wrap my head around it. And so it's also really important to keep the conversation going both ways. And to that end, I would love to hear you riff a little bit about the importance of listening to younger psychedelic voices now, and particular, like, what issues are different, what things are rising for them or for you that is represents a kind of change in some of the issues that people are talking about, and some of the opportunities that you see for expanding and growing this community and this conversation outside of its existing world.
I think what the younger generations right now, or at least what I have been seeing them doing, is there's a lot of energy to legitimize our experiences and the value of psychedelics. And I feel like, with all of the pioneering research that is going on right now with psychedelics for therapy, we finally have this thing to point at and be like, no, look, the data supports us. So we can't be blown off as easily. And I think that kind of helps give us the freedom to talk more openly about it, to kind of come out more with our experiences. And I don't know, I just see a lot of hope, and I see a lot of potential, and I am really excited about these generations of psychedelic workers, because we're going to be the first ones to get to work with psychedelics in a legal framework. And we're going to be the first ones to be able to say that, be able to say they work with psychedelics without shame or worry. Eventually, come when MAPS or other organizations finally are able to legalize it, I think that will help.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like you can already even though the problems of illegality remain, and people still do time, and we're still in that drug war framework. In terms of your ability to just kind of stand up and go, I'm not a freak, I'm not crazy, I'm not dangerous, and look here, I have all of these organizations and research projects and scientists and therapists, and look at all of this data. It gives you a kind of confidence to be able to be just counted in a way that we never had, because it was like you had to be a kind of a countercultural person. Like, not everybody was counterculture, but most people were, and even if if you just thought about like the Grateful Dead, a lot of the people who were going to shows by the 80s and 90s were, they were lawyers, they were doctors, they were like quote unquote normal people, but there was still a sense that the psychedelic world was like this weekend world, or this other world, this sort of underground world where you kind of like moved in between. And I think that sense of an underground is one of the things that's just disappearing. So even though, dark psy-trance and all-night dancing to whatever is going to seem pretty weird to people if they're listening to, whatever country music and stuff, it still seems pretty peculiar. Your own ability to kind of go, no, look, these are all tools and techniques and situations where we can explore things that are clearly developing this really solid presence, at least for open-minded people in the mainstream, and that must make a huge difference. But another part of it seems to me, is that young people today, particularly, people who are in college, directly coming out of college, there's a kind of renewed sense of political agency and political urgency. I mean, Black Lives Matter is the most kind of obvious example, but there's any number of things that are sort of surrounding these issues of race and gender and sexuality, and how to think about them, how to think around them. And, psychedelics historically in the United States has been extremely white. And pretty hetero. I mean, there have been those, there's major exceptions. We got to, tip the hat right away to like black psychedelia, Latin American psychedelia, gay psychedelia. They've been there. I don't want to crush that, but the dominant tone, the dominant scenes, Deadhead being a perfect example, have been, pretty white and pretty straight.
Yeah.
How's that changing now? How do you see that kind of shift happening?
Yeah, I would also say that, I remember Annie Oak telling a story at one point about how she went to the major psychedelic conference in Basel, Switzerland, and seeing that there were only 2 female speakers during the whole conference, and her just kind of getting this sense of being like, well, this isn't my psychedelic community. And then from that, creating the Women's Visionary Congress. I think that is one example right there of like, we're seeing more thoughts about creating platforms for women, so that it's not just the male voices being present. I think for the current psychedelic culture, though, like something that is to keep in mind is that, it is still a culture that is embedded in our patriarchal capitalistic society. So unfortunately, it's going to show those marks by being super straight, super white, a little more male focused. But I think what we're seeing, though, is that that doesn't make sense with our values as people who are psychedelic explorers, because when I had that religious experience, there was this sense of like unity and oneness. And then if that's the case, that means that I'm one with every single human. So any oppression that human is facing is really my oppression, and it's affecting me as well. So I think we're starting to see with more young people them being aware of that and trying to dismantle their own oppression and trying to create the world that within the psychedelic culture, create the world that they want to see, and hope that that can help spread out to the rest of the culture. I hope that we're making strides in making, the space a less, a space that's more inclusive to people of color, but I still think we have a lot of work on that. I still think we have a lot of work to do when it comes to how women are treated in the spaces. I'm pretty sick of hearing like how many stories I hear about young women taking advantage of, older men who are take on this like guide or guru like kind of position. Like I still feel like that's a really common problem in the psychedelic world. But I think we're becoming aware of it, and I think that we are striving more and more of living by our experience and trying to be a more inclusive space.
Yeah, I mean, one would hope. I mean, along with just feeling the sense of connection with human and also non-human persons,
Mm-hmm.
but is just the way in which if psychedelics can be also understood not just as a possible route towards religious experience and these kinds of really transformative glimpses of a different way of being in the world, but also as almost critical molecules in the sense that they allow you to deconstruct actively your own cultural programming, to think about it in those terms. And, that's how people were talking about them way back in the day, but it was always interesting is that certain cultural programs were seen as being available for deconstruction, like participation in capitalism, and people were, there was a revolutionary interpretation of psychedelics from the 60s on, and the Weathermen loved LSD because it broke down all of your inherited capitalist mores about property and possession, and so people really recognized that they could be, that they could help break down certain kinds of patterns. Other patterns tended not to be on the shelf as much. Male predatory sexuality, for example, seems to still be a very powerful, attractor, and both for cross-cultural situations with women going down to the shamans in Peru or whatever, or the pseudo-shamans or neo-shamans or whatever you want to call them. It's the whole mix. And those kind of situations, we've heard tons of stories about that, but also just within the psychedelic community within the world, there have been definitely major figures who are kind of known for their predatory behavior, and watching that happen and sort of sensing both the opportunity to use wisdom to to sort of dissolve some of those patterns, and at the same time how difficult it is is a kind of it's a sobering issue, because it does seem to be really still rather pervasive. And I don't know whether that's partly can we say that related to the fact that if you look at a lot of contemporary visionary art, a lot of which is very generic at this point, though I still like some of it. But if you look at it, you get there's all these faces of the beautiful young woman and the beautiful young trans. It's all this sort of the attraction towards beauty, and the beauty around women's bodies is still so much part of this imagery in a way that like it was something that's more punk rock or avant-garde. You would never kind of show women in that way because it's just too cheesy. It's just like too like whatever. I mean, so there's sort of a way in which a certain kind of sort of like a organic hippie-ish way of like celebrating the beauty of the female body that also has a kind of tendency to like maybe feed into ways of supporting more traditional, old school ways of relating between the genders that is no longer helpful. I mean, I don't know. I'm just kind of riffing on it. I'd love to hear what you think.
No, that's actually something I talked about sexism within spiritual communities a lot with the talk I did at Evergreen during my conference. And that was just during the conference in general. One of the things I was impressed with was that issues related to social justice were brought up a lot. But no, with visionary art, I feel like visionary art, my biggest critique of it is I'm like, it's so heteronormative. It's very white. It's very, and it's, I don't know, like I have seen so few examples of like portrayals of queer people, for instance, in visionary art. I don't see portrayals of trans people. I see very few images of Black individuals in visionary art, and if I do, they tend to be kind of exotified. And this is kind of what I was saying before, that our psychedelic culture is still coming out of our dominant culture, and that kind of stuff is in our shadow, and a lot of people don't really want to look at it because they benefit from it. And that's the thing too with what the problem we see with still predatory men is that there's this kind of ingrained belief that we inherit from our culture, and it's not our fault that we inherit it from our culture, but just kind of this idea that like men are entitled to women and women are meant to kind of be submissive in that way. And one of the ways that I brought this up is that, you know, during my talk a year and a half ago at Evergreen, I asked people to describe the sacred feminine and sacred masculine. And, you know, with the sacred masculine, people were like powerful, driving, like ambitious. And then the sacred feminine, like, oh, she listens, she holds space, she is a nurturer. And I think that the archetype of feminine and masculine are something that can be helpful. I don't think we should dismiss them entirely, but at the same time too, I also see all of those traits more as human traits and not gendered traits, and that we shouldn't necessarily assume, or I hope we eventually can come to a future where we're not immediately going to assume that one person is more possessing of these traits than another simply because of their assigned gender.
Yeah, that would be nice. I mean, I think it's an interesting problem specifically within psychedelia, because psychedelics does seem to open a realm of the archetypes, and within the realm of our archetypes, our personal archetypes, it's like the archetypes are political too. And so just the fact that you're encountering a certain kind of sense of the sacred feminine doesn't mean that image doesn't have political situations or associations with it, or implications. That's the word I meant. And so there's sort of a sense of like, wow, you know, it's in the visionary space, it's in this dream world, it's in fairy tales, it's in, you know, ancient myths. Great, that's fine. But it doesn't mean that there aren't these sort of implications that we have to have the kind of critical dimension to it as well. And that's what I mean about the way in which the psychedelics have a critical potential that is often underplayed in the light of the desire for enchantment, for transcendence, for beauty, for intimacy, for wonder, all great things. But if we don't also have criticality in there, which means being aware of our own projections, which means being aware of our social location, which means being aware of having to have responsibility for how we speak about and interact with these things in light of their power. If we don't have that, then we're just going to stay in a certain kind of loop, and it becomes more like, you know, whatever, new age party culture or something like that. And I feel like these things are happening. I mean, that's why we're having this conversation. But it definitely can happen more.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. One of the things that also, even in my own history, like I feel like I've gone to like super extremes on my like psychedelic journey, where at one point I was kind of in more of this belief of like gender being very determining of my traits, and feeling like this almost sense of like sacredness around gender and my gender roles, and feeling like how I was like born female as opposed to being socialized female, and then went to the other extreme where I was like, this is all bullshit, like none of these traits are like at me because of like the sex hormones that are in my, you know, in my body. But now I've kind of come more to this middle way of like, all right, there is something to be said about like gender and gender expression that is obviously very real. I identify as being a very feminine woman. I like to wear dresses. I like to have my hair done. I like to have my nails done. And that's something that I have a lot of like fun doing. It's something that I enjoy. but I also don't want, one of the things I worry about is I feel like people see that and, the associations with, oh, here is this very feminine presenting person, therefore she must be submissive, therefore she must be a really quiet person, she must not be like very smart and intelligent. And for me, like, one of the things that I do is I feel like I have a very good balance in myself of the feminine and masculine, and also like the androgynous non-gender. But by being able to be like a very femme presenting individual, but then also at the same time too, like being a very strong, independent woman who is trying to go out and create changes in the world.
Yeah, that's good on you. But I think it's important to emphasize that while you can get to the place you describe without psychedelics, I think that the way in using them consciously and critically, as well as exuberantly and spiritually, can help bring you to that place and precisely that middle ground between the way in which we are bodies. We are bodies with natural histories, with their own agendas, with their own patterns, with their own forces, whether or not we think about that in terms of gender or mood or the cycles of the moon or whatever you want to say. It's like we are physical bodies, and those bodies take chemicals, and the metabolism of those chemicals produces effects. It's a deeply biological process on the one hand. And on the other hand, you're introduced into this world of images, of stories, of myths, of cultures, of histories, all of this strange kind of much more virtual sort of reality where things are veiled and shifting and shimmering, and that openness, that possibility of telling new stories, of engaging different stories, of mixing up stories, all of that is also sort of part of the mix. So I see psychedelics ideally as a place where we reconcile and indeed, intensify even the way in which our cultural programming on the one hand interacts with the biological world that we are already embedded in.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think also on the other hand too, one of my concerns about psychedelics as well is that I've also seen the opposite happen, where people become stronger in their beliefs of the ideas that have been kind of handled to them through patriarchy, such as like having those ideas of gender and gender roles like strongly reinforced. Like the man is supposed to have more control in the relationship, like almost like that the way I see religion kind of playing out in Christianity, where the man is considered to be, the stronger one in the relationship. Which that's really interesting to me, that I also see psychedelics kind of doing the opposite of that. But I mean, it also kind of reminds me that there was a period of time when psychedelics are still legal, where they were trying to use psychedelics to, they gave them to individuals who identified as gay, and they tried to turn them straight with psychedelics. And it's like,
well, we're going to have to end it right there.
Okay.
Yeah. We're going to have to end it there, Katie. Thanks so much for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for having me.
All right, folks, until next week, we'll be talking about the Yazidi. Keep your minds open.